Kissinger among the first to work on a strategic relationship with China, normalizing diplomatic ties under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Dr. Kissinger visited China more than 100 times, most recently meeting with Xi Jinping back in July. He said in a speech at the Al Smith dinner last month, where I attended this, quote, "In China, the U.S. for the first time encounters a country with resources potentially comparable to its own. Each country thinks itself exceptional, but in different ways. China expects that its civilization, continuity, and magnitude will command respect. America acts on the conviction that its values are universally applicable. The key test is whether these concepts of national greatness can coexist." Joining me right now is Atlas Organization founder and the author of The Decisive Decade, Jonathan D.T. Ward. Jonathan, great to have you this morning. Thanks very much for being here. I think when Dr. Kissinger first went to China, there was a feeling across the world, certainly in America as well, that maybe if America can explain and communicate the benefits of democracy, the benefits of freedom, that maybe China would come to the middle. And Dr. Kissinger tried to do that to ensure that these two nations could work together. But over the last 10 years, China has moved inward, much more communist than certainly Dr. Kissinger, I think, was expecting.
Well, sure. And look, I mean, he was a great American who led an extraordinary life. I think made very undeniable contributions to U.S. foreign policy and saw us through a very difficult chapter of the Cold War. And I think it's important to separate his legacy, his time as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, which were really in the heart of the Cold War era, with what came afterwards once we started to try to normalize the CCP and bring them into the global economy. And, those two things, I think, are very different. I was able to meet him a couple of times over the years. When I was about 24 years old, I first read Diplomacy when I was considering a career in national service, and there's just nothing like it. I mean, the caliber and scope of his written work is just amazing. But it's still possible to be wrong about one big thing, and I think tragically, Dr. Kissinger was wrong about China, and partly because his training, as a historian, he was a historian of Europe, which was essentially about a balance of power between states in a Westphalian system, and the worldview in Beijing and certainly in the Communist Party is a hierarchical system where one state sits at the top of all others. And you can see him even in the statement that he made in July that you referenced, trying to reconcile this idea of coexistence between the two superpowers, the fact that we now encounter in China a state with resources comparable to our own, but China never would have had those resources without the opening to China and the subsequent normalization. And the openings in a Cold War context, right. I mean, they were very concerned at the time about the Soviet Union attacking China and replacing the Communist Party then with a pro-Soviet regime. That's what he told my supervisor at Oxford in a BBC interview at one point. But later on, we get to this point where engagement takes on a life of its own, and we create a second superpower through access to our markets and technology and all the rest of it.
For sure. And we're continuing to amplify and empower that superpower that is China by enabling American investors to invest in companies tied to the Chinese military. It's still an issue. In the speech that we're talking about this morning, this is one of Kissinger's last foreign policy speeches. He made it at the Al Smith dinner last month, October 18th, and he writes, and he said on stage, regarding Taiwan, the conflicting positions have been too different to permit an immediate permanent solution. If we want to avoid both conflict with China and an abandonment of Taiwan, we should find a way to make the current dangerous situation tolerable. Jonathan, a diplomatic enterprise to maintain an equilibrium over time, he writes, on Taiwan.
Well, and sure, and Taiwan was certainly one of the issues when he first went to China to basically kick that off into the future. And Mao said, we don't need to resolve this for another 70 years or so. And now we're reaching that juncture when, of course, Mao couldn't do anything about it. I mean, they were planning an invasion of Taiwan in the early 50s. And then because of the Korean War, they had to abort those plans. So, he was negotiating at the beginning with a power that was unable to do anything about its territorial interests in that regard. And now we're in something fundamentally different. So I think, Kissinger is still struggling with this idea of peace between the superpowers, which I think is often misunderstood. I think his real life's work and mission was to establish peace in a Cold War world and to prevent a Third World War. And yet here we are, as he said, in the foothills of a second Cold War. But the problem is, I think, ultimately we won the first Cold War, and there's still a path to actually winning this one. And he was a contributor to American victory in the first Cold War. So his legacy, if anything, what I respect most is he was wrong about China, but he was right about America. And I wrote about him in both The Decisive Decade and China's Vision of Victory. And he said something which I used at the end, where he called the United States the modern world's decisive articulation of the human quest for freedom and an indispensable geopolitical force for the vindication of humane values, which I think is one of the most beautiful statements that any American diplomat has ever said about their own country. And I think his real legacy will be to show to show some of us how to succeed, how to win in a very difficult thing. But we do have to abandon the idea that China is any kind of partner to the United States. That's a deep misconception.
Especially,
and you understand that many do, but many do not.
Yeah, especially
and
after the communist nation unleashed a virus, COVID-19, on the world and then covered it up. House Energy and Commerce Committee Republicans have written a letter to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This sent yesterday, demanding the agency hand over everything they know about the surge of respiratory illnesses in children in China now. They write this, Jonathan: it would be an abdication of the American people if it allows China to repeat its misdeeds of the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization requesting more data now from China on this outbreak as well, Jonathan. So here we have another outbreak raging in China right now, a respiratory outbreak. What have you learned about this, Jonathan? Are we at risk of where we were back in 2020 of another COVID-19-like disease coming into America?
Oh, sure. So still very early, of course. And what I've heard so far is it's a disease that mostly affects children, hence the increase in children going to hospitals, and that it may be resistant to antibiotics. So a kind of walk-in pneumonia with milder symptoms, and something that could be a real issue. I mean, these things do spread globally. They can. I remember actually sitting in the green room about to go on your TV show in about January of 2020 and listening to an infectious disease specialist tell me that this was going to go global. And that was, kind of early on. And there it was, 6 weeks later, just fully global.
Tom
that's
Cotton
possible.
told us the same thing on Sunday Morning Futures in February of 2020. And he was very clear in saying this is not anything that nature created. This is likely man-made, and it likely escaped from the Wuhan lab. But here you have government censorship once again. He was attacked. The show was attacked. I was attacked because Tom Cotton said truth. And the White House worked with Twitter, with YouTube to censor all of that, Jonathan. We just did the breaking news this morning with Hillary Vaughn.
Well, and, bottom line, it's still too early to tell how this will go, but I don't think China was never held accountable in any meaningful way for COVID-19, and, they're not going to, they funneled a ton of disinformation through the WHO. That relationship really went awry at the time. So I think we can't expect them to be any more honest or behave any better when it comes to sharing real information or letting anybody know what's really going on.
That's
but
true.
Still early to tell.
Jonathan, good to see you this morning. Thanks very much.